The moon hung low over the windswept plains, an enormous silver disk illuminating a swaying sea of tall grass. The night air smelled of campfires and horse sweat, mingled with a distant tang of ice on the wind. Khal Drogo surveyed his riders from atop his mighty war stallion, the flickering flames reflecting in his dark eyes. He appeared as fearsome as legends told, a towering presence of muscle, braided hair draping down his broad back, and a face etched with scars earned from countless victories. If any had thought the great Khal lost to the grave, they would now stand corrected. Fate, and more than a little magic, had brought him back to the world of the living and to war. Legend claimed that Khal Drogo had once perished from a festering wound, unable to move or speak, a once great man reduced to near helplessness. In another tale of an alternate reality, Daenerys Targaryen tried to save his life with blood magic. It had sealed him in a living death, though his spirit had roamed the night sky. But in this story, the flames of the pyre did not simply consume his mortal husk and free the mother of dragons. Instead, they opened a path between life and death, a crack in the twilight realm. His spirit, still fiercely bound to the mortal plane by honor and vengeance, found a way back. He emerged like a phantom in the smoke, body and will restored by the same fire that had birthed dragons. Though Daenerys Targaryen had parted ways with him, her destiny calling her elsewhere, Khal Drogo remained, body renewed and hair unshorn by defeat. The wound that once crippled him was gone, replaced by a jagged scar, the only hint of his brush with the darkness beyond. He returned to the Dothraki Sea, forging alliances with once rival Khalasars. Word spread, the great Khal lived once more. The scattering of riders who had once followed him arrived to test the truth for themselves. And upon seeing his towering presence, many dropped to their knees, pounding fists against their chests in respect to the man they still believed unconquered by any mortal foe. They looked upon the uncut braid, the absence of the bells he once wore to mark his victories, a deliberate statement to those who might challenge him. He had returned from death unbound by old conventions, ready to forge a new path of conquest. Or so he thought. For though the Dothraki Sea seemed unchanged, whispered rumors passed from traveler to traveler, drifting into the grasslands. The dead were stirring in the north. A new cold was creeping down, carried on an icy wind. Strange silhouettes in the distant corners of the night flickered in campsite tales, the sort of horrors that made even the fiercest Dothraki warriors' blood run cold. The Night King, the pale demon from beyond the wall, was leading an army of the dead across the frozen wastes. No mortal blade could easily stop them, no fortress gate could remain closed forever, and the foe's victory would bring eternal darkness. Khal Drogo, hearing these rumors, first scoffed at the idea that any man, living or dead, could stand against the Dothraki in open battle. But the fear in the eyes of the travelers, the spine-chilling details in each story, the sense of unstoppable doom that pervaded them all, sowed a seed of uneasy curiosity in his heart. He longed to prove himself once more in glorious conflict, to test his skill and that of his Khalasar against a foe that men called unstoppable. Thus began the great Khal's march northward. He gathered the mightiest of the Dothraki from all corners of Essos. Not all joined willingly, some Khalasars refused to heed his summons, suspecting trickery or illusions. But Khal Drogo rode out personally with only a few hand-picked blood riders at his side, challenging any Khal who spurned him. He met them in single combat beneath the open sky. Over and over, steel clashed in the swirling dust of the grasslands. The watchers saw him fight as though possessed by the old gods, never once wavering in speed or strength. His ferocity seemed almost supernatural, fueled by the same cosmic bargain that had restored his life. Each rebellious Khal fell, and their warriors bowed their heads in acceptance. Soon Drogo commanded the largest Khalasar the Dothraki Sea had ever seen, a tide of horses that might rival the waves of the ocean. Across wide rivers and rolling hills, this endless line of riders advanced west and north, forging a path that dwarfed merchant caravans or pilgrimages. Villages along the way saw them approach like a thunderous storm, thousands of hoofs stirring dust and pounding the earth in an unrelenting drumbeat of war. Envoys from Westeros ventured across the narrow sea to treat with Khal Drogo, each with anxious eyes and carefully chosen words. Some spoke of alliances, some offered gold, others threatened him, warning him that the lands beyond the sea were not for the Dothraki to trample. But Drogo had grown far beyond those petty enticements or intimidations. His sole aim was more profound. He had heard the dead men marched on the living, and he recognized that if the world fell under an eternal night, even the mighty Khalasar would vanish into unbroken darkness. To prove his might against the unstoppable foe was a call he could not ignore. The crossing to Westeros proved simpler than it might have been years before. Many ships had been captured or abandoned in the tumult of other wars. The chain of events that had transpired from across the sea, including the Targaryen attempt to retake the Iron Throne, had left behind confusion in ports and confusion in the hearts of men. At first, the prospect of ferrying a horde of Dothraki across the sea would have seemed laughable, yet the great Khal, tall and imposing, with that uncanny scar upon his chest, spoke with the authority of legend. Step by step, day by day, the impossible was achieved. The Dothraki began landing on Westeros's eastern shores, releasing their horses to thunder onto foreign soil, wide-eyed and eager for new conquests. Towns along the coastline emptied or barricaded themselves as the Dothraki arrived in countless numbers. Yet the stories of the undead threat had reached Westeros as well, and fear had begun seeping in among the small folk. Whether the people trusted these newcomers or not, whether they loved or hated them, most had not the will to resist. The Dothraki were unstoppable in open combat. But the real war, the one that Khal Drogo had come to wage, lay to the north, beyond wide meadows and forests, beyond the old strongholds of the Seven Kingdoms, and ultimately beyond even the expanse of the north. In those days, the north was already changing. White winds howled across the moors, carrying with them unnatural cold. The living huddled behind thick walls, cowering by their hearths, whispering that winter was truly here in its darkest form. They spoke of the army of the dead descending from the far side of the wall. Many recalled the rumors that House Stark, House Mormont, House Umber, and all the others had raised their banners in a desperate stand. But the undead horde swept across the tundra with unstoppable force, adding the slain to their ranks. Where they passed, the land froze and hope dimmed. A rumor reached Khal Drogo's ears that the armies of the north had engaged the enemy on the plains south of Winterfell, and that the battle had ended in near ruin. The Night King led White Walkers, and monstrous abominations of frost and death. The living could not stand against their relentless assault. When Khal Drogo finally arrived in the north with his massive khalasar, he found a land stripped raw by despair. The skies seemed perpetually gray, and the biting wind stung the flesh of men used to warmer climes. The endless horizon of brown grass and rolling hills gave way to rocky crags, scattered pine forests, and half-frozen rivers. The snow lay in patches, as if uncertain whether it was truly winter or a more permanent darkness. Villagers gazed upon the Dothraki and wondered if they were salvation or a new wave of destruction to add to their misery. But Khal Drogo saw only a battle to be won. The children of the grasslands might find little of comfort here, but war was their solace, and victory their reason for living. He was no fool, though. Tales had reached him. Normal steel shatters against White Walkers. The Whites do not die easily, nor do they feel pain or fear. They must be burned or destroyed by dragonglass or Valyrian steel. Fire was their greatest vulnerability. The great Khal, newly wise from his brush with the Beyond, listened to each word of counsel from those who had faced the dead. He remembered Daenerys's lessons of the dragon's breath, and that which the living call magic. He knew these would be his greatest weapons. He ordered his blood riders to gather every scrap of dragon glass they could find to coerce blacksmiths into forging specialized arrowheads and spears. He demanded the hoarding of pitch and oil for flaming arrows. His intent was to adapt the savage skill of the Dothraki to the savage demands of this war. Some among his khalasar balked at using such cowardly methods as flaming arrows, for the Dothraki prized close combat, the thrill of hacking and slashing an opponent up close. But Drogo, scar on his chest burning like an omen, roared that they would do whatever it took to defeat these pale demons. If the army of the Night King was truly unstoppable by normal means, then the children of the Horse would learn new ways, swift as desert raiders, cunning as the wind, and relentless as the tide. Their first skirmishes with the dead came on a cold evening near the Last Hearth, a castle that once stood proud among the northern strongholds. Smoke still rose from parts of it as if the place had been scorched by some monstrous violence. The Dothraki outriders spotted a swarm of whites trailing through the pines, skeletal figures dragging themselves through the snow, eyes glowing with eerie blue light. The outriders galloped back to Khal Drogo, confirming what they had heard. That was the moment the great Khal had been waiting for. Rallying his men with a fierce war cry, he ordered the first wave to ride out in a wide arc, encircling the enemy. Soon the Dothraki screeches split the air, an undulating cry of savage joy as their hoofs shook the ground. The undead, blank-faced and unfeeling, continued forward with mechanical determination. Fire blossomed in the twilight as the Dothraki archers released volley after volley of flaming arrows. In that first volley alone, dozens of wights collapsed into burning heaps, but hundreds more pressed on, single-minded. Their tattered rags fluttered in the wind, their flesh pale, half-rotten, or simply caked with ice. The Dothraki horsemen fanned out like a scythe of darkness around them, swords curved and glinting in the orange glow. Some wielded freshly forged dragonglass aurochs, untested in true war. Drogo himself led the charge, his own blade shimmering ominously with black volcanic edges, a gift from an ally in the north. When blade met bone, the wights shuddered and many fell, fracturing like brittle ice. But they swarmed as a horde, eager to pull living men from their horses, to bury them in snow and tear them apart with claw-like hands. Drogo fought at the center, horse racing through the chaos, swinging his weapon in wide arcs. Each strike shattered limbs, severed torsos, reduced the dead to inert corpses. Sparks danced around him from the flaming arrows that rained from above, setting undead flesh aflame. The smell of burnt hair and rancid smoke filled the air. More than once, a wight leaped at Drogo, only to be trampled under the hooves of his stallion or cut in half by the furious slash of his auroch. He roared commands for his men to circle, to avoid letting themselves be overwhelmed. The Dothraki, masters of maneuvering in open terrain, quickly learned that the key to victory lay in movement. Do not allow the dead to pull you down and swarm you. Keep riding, keep swinging, keep firing until every last one is destroyed. The battle took a toll. Some Dothraki warriors, flush with overconfidence, charged in too close and were dragged from their mounts. Their screams were muffled by the wights piling on them, teeth gnashing, icicle-like claws ripping flesh. Blood stained the snow in wide arcs. But soon, the wights were reduced to frozen fragments. Khal Drogo's strategy of surrounding them and attacking from all angles, coupled with the lethal kiss of dragonglass, proved devastating to these lesser ranks of the Night King's horde. When the fighting ceased, the Dothraki discovered roughly 100 of their riders had perished. The dead left behind charred remains that slowly melted into the snow. But the first victory was theirs. Yet Drogo knew that this was only a taste. The Night King's true legion would be far larger and far more fearsome. White Walkers, their tall, gaunt forms clad in ice-like armor, carried swords of freezing crystal that could shatter normal steel. Rumors spoke that the Night King himself possessed the power to raise the dead from freshly fallen corpses, swelling his ranks in the midst of battle. The great Khal might have proven that the Dothraki were formidable, but he also knew that if they took the field against the main host without a plan, they would be buried in an ocean of undead. He needed reinforcements, alliances. He needed knowledge. News arrived that a great gathering of living forces was taking shape near Winterfell's battered walls, the battered heart of the north. Sansa Stark, the Lady of Winterfell, had appealed to all corners of the realm to stand united in this darkest hour. Knights, peasants, mercenaries, any able-bodied warrior were heading for the castle. Unsure of whether they could trust the Dothraki, they still recognized the urgent truth. In the face of the long night, no difference in culture or creed could matter. Survival demanded unity. So, the great Khal and his mighty Khalasar rode for Winterfell, expecting little in the way of courtesy, but determined to face the real threat shoulder to shoulder with any who stood for life. The sight that greeted them upon their arrival was grim. Winterfell's once proud battlements bore fresh scars. Makeshift reinforcements were being hastily constructed. The ground was churned from repeated conflicts, and mounds of fresh earth indicated countless graves. Northmen in furs, knights in battered armor, and wildlings wrapped in skins all mingled about the courtyard. Everyone's face was drawn with exhaustion and fear. Eyes widened as the Dothraki began pouring in through the gates in endless columns. Horses snorted white plumes in the cold air, hooves clacking on frozen ground. Tension crackled in every corner. Those who had once heard terrifying tales of the horse lords from across the sea stood aside with equal parts dread and relief, uncertain whether these savage warriors would help them or ravage them. Khal Drogo dismounted and strode forward, leading a small retinue. He was an imposing presence, his arms and chest bare despite the freezing winds, his muscles corded with tension. The scar across his chest seemed to catch the firelight from braziers in the courtyard, making the old wound look like a molten brand. Lords and ladies of the north looked upon him warily, but the need for alliances in the face of the undead overcame any immediate hostility. Lady Sansa Stark emerged, regal in her thick furs, blue-gray eyes reflecting a quiet determination. She looked upon Drogo with open curiosity, having heard that he was once husband to Daenerys Targaryen. The rumor that he had died and returned with unearthly power whispered through the keep like an unsettling wind. Whatever the truth, she knew that an army of skilled riders might tip the balance when the Great War came crashing upon their walls. They conferred in the Great Hall, a motley gathering of men with many grudges and old wounds. There were northern lords who still recalled the rumors of Targaryen alliances with the Dothraki, men who believed foreigners had no place in the north. But necessity overshadowed prejudice. The White Walkers would not care about these petty differences when they came with the silent hunger of death. The greatest question was whether Winterfell itself could stand, for the fortress had already been tested by skirmishes with the undead. Some proposed retreating further south, but none could articulate a better place to make a stand. Others insisted on scattering the living armies to harass the undead with guerrilla tactics, but that risked letting the Night King slip through and devour the realm piece by piece. Khal Drogo listened, though the common tongue was not his mother's speech, and spoke in short, direct statements through one of his bloodriders who had learned the language well enough to interpret. He declared he would ride out to meet the dead under the open sky, for that was the Dothraki's element of strength. He wanted them to come upon the plains so he could hammer them with swift cavalry tactics and draw them away from the fortress. The plan was bold, dangerous, but it also held promise, for letting the dead assault the walls directly might lead to a siege. And in a siege, the Night King could whittle away at morale, raising any fallen defenders to turn upon their own. At last, the War Council settled on a plan. The Dothraki, along with contingents of northern cavalry and a few daring knights, would set an ambush in the plains a few miles from Winterfell. They would lure the main bulk of the undead army into a vicious engagement. Meanwhile, archers fortified on the walls would unleash flaming death from afar. Lines of trenches filled with flammable oils and spikes of dragonglass would be arranged in layers to slow the enemy's advance and funnel them into kill zones. If the cavalry could break the White Walkers' formation, or kill enough whites before they reached the fortress, the defenders at Winterfell might stand a chance. Every detail was weighed and measured, knowing that a single flaw might unravel everything. The great Khal's confidence fortified the hearts of some. The image of thousands of mounted warriors, out in the snowy night, wielding weapons specifically crafted to kill the undead, brought a spark of hope to the hopeless. When night fell, it was a night like no other. The sky was starless, clouds heavy with snow, the air bitterly cold. Wind whistled through the barren trees. Torches and braziers glowed faintly along Winterfell's walls, revealing silhouettes of archers standing ready. Beyond the fortress, on the plains, the cavalry had taken position in a wide crescent. At its heart was the greatest concentration of Dothraki, led by Drogo himself. Their horses stamped impatiently, breath steaming, manes flecked with frost. Yet the riders displayed no fear. They chanted low war cries under their breath, each syllable promising savage glory. The crackle of pitch-laden arrows dipped into torch flame broke the silence. The watchers on the walls held their breath, straining to see what lay beyond. They knew the undead marched silently. No horns, no battle cries, just the endless crunch of snow beneath their feet. Occasionally, an eerie moan carried through the darkness, the lament of a lost soul or a bone-chilling echo of things beyond mortal ken. And then they appeared, a massive tide of silhouettes in the distance, an ebb and flow of moving shadows with eyes of cold fire. The whites marched in the tens of thousands, perhaps more, surging forward like unstoppable surf. Intermixed among them were figures mounted on dead horses, White Walkers whose pale skin and regal gait hinted at centuries of deadly prowess. Their weapons, shimmering in the gloom, could shatter steel and freeze flesh in a heartbeat. Above them all, on a towering undead steed of impossible cold, rode a figure robed in darkness and crowned with horns of ice, the Night King. He surveyed the living lines with an expressionless face, yet the chill that spread from him was like a physical wave, sapping courage and gnawing at hope. In a moment, Khal Drogo raised his arak high, the burnished dragonglass edge glittering with reflected flame. Then, with a thunderous war cry, the Dothraki charged. The crescent of cavalry thundered forward, hooves drumming on frozen earth, rolling forward like a living avalanche. The riders loosed their flaming arrows into the sky, a golden arc raining down upon the front ranks of the undead. Fire erupted among the wights, limbs and torsos ignited, forming a patch of infernal glow in the darkness. The second wave of arrows followed a heartbeat later, then a third, each volley accompanied by the fierce shouts of warriors eager to test their mettle. Still, the wights trudged on, pushing through the flames, some collapsing as living torches, others continuing with mechanical inevitability. White walkers advanced behind them, stepping into the inferno. Where their ice blades swiped, the flames seemed to recoil. Some of the burning wights rose again, reanimated anew, though their scorched bodies moved with disjointed motions. But the Dothraki and the northern horsemen did not relent. They crashed into the undead line with unstoppable momentum, arrocs, swords, and dragonglass spears swinging and thrusting. The first moments of contact were a bloody maelstrom. Horses screamed as they collided with ranks of rotting bodies. The living warriors hacked and slashed, many pulling back on reins to wheel around for another pass. The wights clawed at horses' legs, trying to drag them down, while above them soared more flaming arrows from the archers on Winterfell's walls. Amid this chaos, Khal Drogo was a force of nature. He rode at the forefront, a rack held high. When he struck, it was as if the weapon came alive in his grip, slicing through wight after wight. He bellowed commands for his men to split and encircle, to trap segments of the undead in pockets and overwhelm them with superior mobility. To the watchers from the ramparts, it was a breathtaking sight. Thousands of riders swirling in intricate patterns, reminiscent of some savage dance that only the Dothraki could orchestrate. Clouds of snow kicked up, lit by the flicker of flames, giving the battlefield a nightmarish beauty. Yet the undead pressed on, unfeeling, unthinking. Drogo spotted a group of white walkers further back, each astride a gaunt corpse of a horse. One turned its pale, regal face toward him, ice-blue eyes narrowing. The great Khal could almost sense the frigid fury emanating from that creature. With a guttural yell, he rallied a squad of his best riders and charged. Those riders pounded the earth, arrowheads dipped in dragon glass. They fired at the White Walkers, but the wintry knights swatted aside or shattered many arrows with unnatural speed, their freezing blades dissolving wood and obsidian in showers of frost. Still, some found their mark. One White Walker screeched as a dragonglass arrow lodged in its collar, fracturing its form. Its entire body shattered like crystalline glass, scattering shards across the snow. The sight spurred the Dothraki to greater boldness. If these ice demons could be killed, they would be killed. A White Walker galloped toward Khal Drogo, sword raised in challenge. Drogo met it with a furious slash of his arak. Steel and ice collided with a shower of sparks. The White Walker's horse lunged, skeletal teeth snapping at Drogo's stallion. But Drogo maneuvered expertly, pivoting so that the other rider's sword whiffed past his head. He responded with a quick backhand slash, slicing across the White Walker's midsection. Frost-like cracks spiderwebbed from the point of impact. Another strike, and the White Walker crumbled into shimmering shards that scattered in the wind. Drogo roared in triumph, lifting his blade overhead in defiance of the biting cold. His stallion reared, hoofs striking the night air, a proud avatar of savage glory. But far away, cloaked in swirling snow, the Night King observed everything from a ridge of ice. With measured calm, he raised one hand. From behind him, a deeper shadow moved, a monstrous white giant, half-decayed but towering over the field. It lumbered forth, each step shaking the earth. Elsewhere, more White Walkers arrived, and the endless wave of whites streamed around the battlefield to encircle the living. Night closed in. The Dothraki were an avalanche of rage, but there seemed no end to the dead. Even as the cavalry hammered one flank, the undead pressed in from three other sides. Panicked shouts erupted from the northern horsemen as more of the undead giants emerged, flailing massive clubs carved from ice. Some clubs crashed onto groups of riders, scattering them like insects. Screams cut short under tons of frozen force. Broken horses and men littered the snow, which quickly turned red beneath them. Drogo, fighting deeper in the chaos, felt a surge of dread as he saw one of the enormous undead giants heading for his position. He barked an order, and ranks of Dothraki bowmen wheeled their mounts, letting loose volley after volley of flaming arrows. The giant roared, battered by fire, but still it trudged closer. Its milky eyes glowed eerily. Drogo goaded his stallion forward. He galloped straight at the giant, weaving through whites that snapped at his stirrups. At the final instant, he hurled a spear with all the strength in his arm. The dragonglass tip found purchase in the giant's throat. With a thunderous groan, the towering figure toppled, crashing into a cluster of whites below, crushing them under its weight. A triumphant roar rose among the Dothraki, a moment of raw exultation amid the gloom. Yet this was only one giant, more advanced, unstoppable in their dead might. Flaming trenches ringed Winterfell, bursting into walls of flame that devoured whites unlucky enough to stumble in. But the White Walkers began freezing segments of the trench with their unholy power, forging paths for their minions to cross. Inside the fortress walls, archers loosed arrow after arrow until their quivers ran empty, while swordsmen rushed to the battlements to repel any whites that climbed. Knights of the Vale, men of the North, wildlings, and free folk found themselves fighting side by side with Dothraki who had dismounted to lend aid. At times, men who once would have called each other mortal enemies now stood back to back against skeletal horrors. The blizzard intensifying overhead cast the battlefield into swirling chaos. Visibility shrank and torchlight flickered in the dark, revealing fleeting glimpses of horrors. Shattered bodies stirred anew, roused by the Night King's dark magic to fight again for death's cause. Khal Drogo, at the forefront of the cavalry, sensed a shift in the air. A hush came upon the battlefield as though the wind itself paused in dread. Riders faltered, uncertain of what was happening. Then the whites at the edges of the plain fell back, parting like water around a stone. Through the swirling snow, the Night King advanced on his undead steed, the embodiment of winter's malice. He locked his glacial gaze upon the great Khal. The challenge was silent but undeniable. Drogo's blood pounded in his ears. This was the moment he had hungered for, the ultimate test of strength. He urged his horse forward, brandishing his arak with grim resolve. Yet even as he rode, the Night King lifted a single hand. A wave of power rippled across the field. All around Drogo, corpses of men and Dothraki who had recently fallen began to twitch. Dead eyes opened, glowing that same cold blue. The fallen rose, swords still clutched in lifeless grips, some missing limbs, some with horrific wounds. One by one, they turned upon their living brothers. The heartbreak of it was worse than any physical blow. The living saw their friends and comrades, even family, stand once more, but with that empty stare. The shock sent a tremor through the ranks. Some men hesitated, unwilling to strike down loved ones reanimated as monstrous puppets. Drogo's heart clenched painfully as he recognized some of the braided hair of fallen Dothraki now rising as whites. He knew them by name, men who had served him loyally across countless battles, men he had personally tested in single combat to prove their worth in his Khalasar. Now they shuffled forward, araks drooping in stiff fingers. He felt an unfamiliar ache in his chest, loss and fury braided together. With a savage bellow, he spurred his stallion onward, commanding the living to push past the horror and fight. For if they failed, this was the fate of all the living. Arrows and spears once more found their mark among the newly risen dead, sending them sprawling. But the shock had cost precious momentum. More whites poured forward, and the living lines buckled. Up on the ridge, the Night King continued his approach, face devoid of emotion. His eyes were fixed on the great Khal, as though recognizing an equal threat, someone brought back by powers beyond mortal comprehension. The hush that followed them seemed almost reverent, like the hush before a final reckoning. Drogo dismounted. He knew, somehow, that this confrontation demanded more than cavalry charges. A sense of primal destiny called him to stand eye to eye with this monstrous entity that threatened the whole of the world. The freezing wind whipped his hair around his scarred face as he strode through the carnage, stepping past moaning whites and the occasional battered living warrior still struggling. He brandished his arak, that dragonglass edge shimmering with an otherworldly sheen. The Night King gazed down at Drogo. Then, in a slow, deliberate motion, he dismounted as well. The undead steed remained as still as a statue of ice. Snow billowed around them, thick as a curtain. In that swirling darkness, they faced each other. Two beings shaped by forces beyond the natural cycle of life. One returned through fire and blood magic, the other an ageless champion of winter's wrath. Drogo snarled a war cry, launching himself forward with lightning speed. His arak descended in a killing stroke aimed at the Night King's neck. But the Night King moved with inhuman swiftness, raising an arm and materializing a sword of frost. Steel and ice crashed, sending a shock wave through the air. Drogo felt the cold radiating from that sword, biting into his hands, as if it might freeze the very blood in his veins. He gritted his teeth, refusing to relent. With a powerful twist, he forced the Night King's blade aside and lunged with a savage thrust. But the Night King slid backward, leaving only empty air for Drogo to strike. Then came the counterattack, a slash that barely missed Drogo's left arm, slicing through the leather bracer and grazing skin beneath. A wave of unnatural cold shot through Drogo's body, threatening to numb his limbs. He snarled, forcing himself to push past the pain. Another clash followed, each blow resonating with a strange echo, as if the frosty steel warred against the dragonglass with cosmic fury. Sparks of ice and fire spat from each impact. Around them, men and whites continued their own struggles, but none dared intrude on this epic duel. Blow after blow, Drogo poured every ounce of strength and skill into breaking the Night King's defenses. Each time he was met with a calm, inhuman counter. He felt frustration gnaw at his mind. This was a foe unlike any mortal man. The great Khal had bested swordsmen, champions from across Essos, other Khals who prided themselves on savage cunning. But this being was beyond such mortal constraints. A small voice in Drogo's mind whispered that this fight might end in his second and final death. But he recalled the face of Daenerys, the memory of her trying to save him, the sense of destiny that had led him back to the land of the living. No, he would not fall again. He was Khal Drogo, the great rider, the unburnt sun and stars. He had a promise to fulfill, to preserve life against the creeping dark. And with that determination blazing within him, he renewed the assault. The Night King advanced with a series of frigid thrusts, forcing Drogo to parry. Each collision numbed Drogo's muscles a bit more, as if the cold sought to devour his flesh. He spat blood and curses, refusing to retreat, until finally he found the opening he sought. Dodging a sweeping strike by dropping to one knee, he slashed the Night King's side, raking dragonglass across immortal flesh. A fracture line of frost spread outward from the wound, spiderwebbing across the Night King's torso. For the first time, the ancient creature stiffened, releasing a hissing breath like steam on a frozen lake. But the Night King did not shatter. Instead, with one defiant motion, he brought the hilt of his sword crashing into Drogo's temple. The world spun. Drogo fell back, his vision blurred by sparks of light. He scrambled away, a savage growl escaping his throat. Blood trickled down his face, and his ears rang. A wave of despair threatened to drown him. What if even dragonglass could not fully destroy this entity? Then the thought crystallized. The legend spoke of dragonfire, or Valyrian steel, or the combined might of living armies. Perhaps only direct flame from a dragon's maw could melt the Night King's essence. But Daenerys was far away, her dragons carrying her in another conflict, or so the rumors said. No help would come from that quarter. The harsh reality of the swirling battlefield sharpened around him. The whites were closing in, unstoppable. Dothraki forces had regrouped, continuing to slash and burn. They fought with breathtaking skill, but they were being pushed back by sheer numbers. The defenders at Winterfell, battered and desperate, were beginning to give ground. If the Night King wasn't stopped here and now, every living creature would be overwhelmed. The howls of the icy wind grew to a crescendo, as if the very heart of winter was exulting in the living's demise. Drogo, battered and bloodied, steadied his breathing. He rose, a rack trembling in his grip. The Night King approached slowly, fissures of ice creeping across his torso but not halting his march. The unstoppable force of winter was so close Drogo could see the unearthly patterns etched into his pale skin. Something in Drogo's scar burned hot, the memory of a life restored by fire, a sign that inside him there remained a spark of that same primal flame. He recalled the ritual that had brought him back, the swirl of shadows, the dancing tongues of fire. If fire had the power to return him to life, perhaps it could deliver victory from the jaws of ice. He let that memory kindle a final burst of resolve in his blood. In a voice that rumbled like distant thunder, he bellowed an oath in the Dothraki tongue, a vow to the great stallion and to the spirits of fire that had once touched him. He would see the end of this demon. Whether he lived or died after, it mattered not. Summoning every shred of will, he rushed the Night King, swinging with such ferocity that the ground trembled under his feet. The Night King met him blow for blow, but each impact sent spiderweb cracks spreading further along the ancient fiend's torso. Ghostly light seeped from the wounds. Drogo's arms felt as though they were on the brink of shattering under the intense cold, but he refused to yield. Then, in a moment of blind intuition, Drogo pivoted past the Night King's guard, hooking an arm around the creature's forearm to prevent him from raising the frost blade. He was met with a stab of freezing agony that threatened to lock every joint in place, but he continued, ramming the dragoglass arak straight into the Night King's chest. Not just a slash, but a plunge, driving it as deep as it would go. The Night King's shriek was soundless yet deafening, echoing in the minds of everyone on the battlefield. The wind howled to match it as though the sky itself mourned its champion. The cracks multiplied, lacing across the Night King's entire body like a shattered mirror. The glow in his icy eyes flickered, a flicker of ancient wrath and final disbelief. For a long heartbeat, Khal Drogo locked eyes with the Night King. The swirling snow caught in a vortex around them. Then, with a resounding crack, the Night King burst apart, shards of ice exploding in all directions like 1,000 tiny daggers. Drogo was thrown back, tumbling across the snow, rolling amidst the broken fragments of this unearthly being. A hush descended as if nature itself paused, uncertain of what came next. And then it happened. In a ripple across the battlefield, every White Walker dissolved into shards of ice, fracturing into nothingness. The Whites, deprived of their master's animating force, collapsed in lifeless heaps, like puppets with their strings severed. The undead giants crumbled, their monstrous frames hitting the ground with thunderous finality. Over the entire plain, over the battered fortress of Winterfell, the army of the dead ceased to be. At first, the living could hardly grasp what had happened. Dothraki warriors froze mid-swing, stepping over husks that no longer snapped at their heels. Archers lowered their bows, staring in disbelief as the horrors they had battled so fiercely simply crumpled to the ground. The storm overhead began to lessen, the gusts of wind weakening as though the furious heart of winter itself had been silenced. Slowly, an exultant cheer rose from the survivors, a cheer mixed with ragged sobs and the moans of the wounded. Hope spread through the living like the first rays of dawn. Khal Drogo lay on his side, breathing heavily. Shards of the Night King's icy remains surrounded him. His hands were stiff with cold, his muscles trembling from the exertion. But he was alive. His vision spun for a moment, and then a wave of sheer relief coursed through him. He pressed a hand to the ground, trying to rise. One of his blood riders, battered and cut, hurried to his side, offering an arm for support. Slowly, painfully, Drogo got to his feet. His gaze traveled over the battlefield, seeing thousands of corpses, both white and living. Smoke rose from patches of scorched earth, and wounded men cried for healers. But no more undead marched upon them. They had survived. They had won. The hush that followed was broken by the approach of the Dothraki. They surrounded their Khal, cheering wildly, pounding their chests, tears streaming down cheeks that seldom wept. Some brandished their weapons toward the sky in salute. Others chanted Drogo's name, proclaiming him the ultimate warrior, the one who had slain the king of the dead. Surviving northern soldiers and knights looked on, unsure of whether to join in the celebration or simply sink to their knees in relief. Lady Sansa and others emerged from Winterfell's gates. She gazed at Drogo with a mixture of awe and horror at what had transpired. The haunting possibility that if this warrior had not come, the entire north might have been swallowed by the long night weighed on everyone's minds. Khal Drogo turned, wiping sweat and blood from his brow, letting the final shards of ice flake away from his shoulders. He lifted his arak in the air. It was chipped and battered, dragonglass edges cracked from the tremendous strain. But the act was symbolic. The Dothraki howled in response. It was a moment of singular unity with the battered defenders of Westeros. They had faced the greatest threat the world had known and had emerged victorious at unimaginable cost. In the following hours, dawn bled across the sky, pale and tentative, revealing the full extent of the carnage. Snow was churned and muddied, corpses scattered everywhere. In pockets, men and women worked together to gather the wounded, to salvage what they could. The living, whether they wore leathers, steel plate, or furs, had survived a night that many believed would be their last. Whispers of grief mingled with the awe at having turned aside the darkness. Khal Drogo, battered though he was, assisted in the grim aftermath. He directed his blood riders to help search for survivors. Whenever they came upon a wounded warrior, be he Northman, Knight of the Vale, or even a sworn foe from some previous conflict, they offered aid in the form of blankets, water, or a strong arm. The Dothraki were often called savages by Westerosi tongues, but in this dawn they demonstrated the solidarity forged by shared adversity. Many looked upon them with newfound respect. As the sun rose, Lady Sansa Stark approached Drogo amid the ravaged plain. She had only a few guards, all wearing exhausted expressions. Her voice trembled with a complex blend of gratitude and sorrow as she spoke haltingly in a language Drogo could understand. "We owe you our lives. If you and your riders had not come, there would be none of us left to greet the morning." Drogo's eyes flickered with a solemn acceptance. Through his Bloodriders translations, he replied, "We are all warriors under the same sky. The dead threatened us all. Now they are dust." Sansa studied him, the flicker of wonder in her gaze. He was no mere man but something shaped by fire and destiny. She quietly dipped her head in respect. "Winterfell is yours for as long as you need shelter. You have saved the North." In her voice was a sincerity that encompassed every man, woman, and child who had survived. Drogo glanced at the fortress, remembering how foreign the stone walls and towers had once seemed. The Dothraki lived by the open grass, the endless horizon. Yet in saving these people, he had proven a depth of honor that transcended old ways. He gave a slight nod, acknowledging her courtesy. The tension that had once existed between his horde and the northern houses had, for the moment, melted away with the dawn. And so it was that Khal Drogo, once the great warlord of the Dothraki Sea, became a legend not only in Essos but in Westeros as well. For generations to come, storytellers and minstrels would recall the night when the army of the dead descended on Winterfell and how the great Khal rode at the head of his Khalasar, fearless in the face of winter's wrath. How he struck the killing blow upon the Night King and ended the long night. Poets would sing of the swirling silhouettes of horsemen against the darkness, the ring of dragonglass upon ice, and the thunderous cry of victory that broke the endless cold. Many would swear that his final blow was guided by the spirits of fire that had raised him from death, the same spirits that had once answered the pleas of a Targaryen queen. In the days that followed, there was still much to do. The living had to burn the scattered remains of whites and bury their own fallen. While the cold did not vanish immediately, it no longer carried that supernatural sting of the Night King's presence. The snows were still deep and the days short, but hope had returned to the north. Many who had once dreaded the Dothraki as raiders and pillagers found themselves at a loss in the face of such a miracle. Their preconceived notions shattered, replaced by a respect as hard as the northern winters. They spoke in hushed tones of how these fierce riders had saved them, forging a bond that no politics or distance could easily break. Meanwhile, Khal Drogo took no pleasure in rest. His mind stirred with the knowledge that the world was changed forever by this conflict. He had no desire for a throne of stone. He craved the open sky, the sweeping plains. Perhaps he would lead his warriors back across the sea, forging a new destiny. Yet part of him recognized that there were other evils in the world that the living could not afford to remain fractured. He listened to rumors of remaining enemies in Westeros, rival claimants to power, shattered alliances. Should he stay to ensure the realm remained united, or ride away, returning the Dothraki to their homeland? For now he lingered, if only to ensure the threat was truly vanquished. They held a feast of remembrance in Winterfell's great hall for all the fallen. The hall was still battered by the war, some windows broken and patched with rough boards, tapestries torn. But the survivors gathered under a roof warmed by hearth fires, the tables lined with meager offerings. Many were still too weary to revel, the memories of horror too fresh. But they raised cups in solemn toasts to the living and the dead. Lady Sansa offered a seat of honor for Khal Drogo and his Bloodriders. Though the Dothraki did not typically sit for feasts in such enclosed spaces, they obliged, if only to show respect for the allies they had fought beside. Quiet murmurs passed among the northern lords, who still seemed astounded by the presence of these warriors in their midst. But none spoke disrespect. The hush that fell when Drogo entered spoke of awe and gratitude. Music played softly, a distant flute and a lone drum. The hall was subdued as though waiting to exhale. Sansa rose and addressed those gathered. She spoke of the immeasurable loss they had all suffered, of the duty they owed to those who gave their lives. She spoke of the endless nights endured. Then she recounted the final confrontation on the battlefield, paying tribute to the Dothraki's pivotal role to Khal Drogo's slaying of the Night King. Many eyes turned to the great Khal, seated on a bench made of thick wood, his scarred arms crossed over his chest, expression unreadable. A hush lingered after her words. Then, unexpectedly, an old northern lord rose shakily to his feet, lifted his cup, and in a trembling voice thanked Khal Drogo for saving his grandchildren. One by one, others followed. Different men and women expressed their gratitude, some halting, some eloquent, but all sincere. Their voices filled the hall with gentle echoes of relief and awe. Drogo did not relish these speeches, he was a man of action. but he recognized the sincerity in their eyes. These people were not his own in the sense of the Dothraki Sea, but in the crucible of battle they had become kin of a kind. When the final voice finished, Drogo looked across the hall. There he saw men who had cursed his name, men who had once feared or hated him simply for being foreign and savage. And now they offered him respect in the only way they knew how, through words and open gratitude. Slowly, Drogo stood. He gestured to the hall. "You fought with courage," he said in rough common tongue, each syllable pronounced carefully. "No fear. We are blood of the same war." It was not a speech that would echo in poems, but the sincerity of it warmed the hearts of the listeners. Khal Drogo, the man reborn from fire, who had cleaved a path through the army of the dead, stood before them as a symbol of what unity could achieve against the darkness. A ripple of murmured acceptance greeted his words. Cups were raised once again, and in that gesture, the fragile bonds of alliance tightened. In the days that followed, the Dothraki made themselves useful around Winterfell. They had little love for stone walls, but they aided in burning the remains of the Whites, tearing down collapsed structures, and patrolling the surrounding roads to ensure no roving pockets of undead persisted. Some scouted far to the north, returning with reports of an eerie silence, as if the land was slowly waking from a nightmare. Everywhere they went, they saw the devastation left behind by the Night King's march, deserted homesteads, fields blackened by frost. But the presence of fresh hoof prints in the snow was a sign that life had not been wholly extinguished. Survivors trickled from hidden refuges, drawn by the hope that the threat was ended. For Khal Drogo, each dawn seemed to intensify the call of the wide horizon. The bond that tethered him to the living, that spark of magic which had restored him, pulsed within. He wondered if he was destined to roam forever, an eternal warrior forging alliances against every shadow. He often stood at the edge of Winterfell's ramparts, peering out across the vast northern expanse. Horses whinnied behind him, waiting as if sensing his restlessness. The north was quiet now, battered but unbroken. Perhaps that was enough. The Great War was over. One morning, as the sun peered through thinning clouds, a small procession gathered in the courtyard. Lady Sansa, a few of her people, and a large contingent of Dothraki were present to see Khal Drogo off. Though many northern lords still hovered uncertainly, they recognized that the time had come for the Dothraki to return to their own ways, across the sea or wherever fate took them. Words of farewell were offered, sometimes in halting attempts at the Dothraki language, sometimes in the common tongue. Gifts were exchanged, some furs for the riders, winter provisions, and a small chest of dragonglass arrowheads that remained. Sansa pressed a token into Drogo's hand, a ring bearing the direwolf sigil. "So you do not forget our gratitude," she said softly. Drogo studied it, then slipped it onto a leather thong he tied around his wrist. He acknowledged her with a nod. He was not a man of many words, but the gesture spoke volumes. Then, with a final glance at the ramparts, the great Khal mounted his stalwart stallion. His blood riders gathered around, hooves churning the snow. In the courtyard, survivors watched with a mixture of relief and sadness. They owed their very existence to this fearsome people they once knew only as a distant legend. Drogo raised an arm, the morning light catching on his uncut braid, the bells that once adorned it replaced now by the silence of memory. The watchers bowed or pressed hands to their hearts. Then, with a thunderous collective cry, the Dothraki galloped out of Winterfell's gates. They surged across the fields, past the old trenches, and onto the main road. Gradually, they split into smaller groups, some forging new paths, scouting for safe passage to the southern coasts, others steering back east. They carried with them the scars of the Great War, but also a pride that few could match. They had faced the darkest night and emerged victorious. Khal Drogo led the central column, pushing onward at a fierce pace. His thoughts drifted to the wide grasses of the Dothraki Sea, to the memory of a sunset's gold washing over endless waves of grass. He recalled his lost child, the son who might have been the stallion who mounts the world, and the woman who had called him her son Anstars. Destiny had torn them apart. Still, in the hush of the galloping horde, he felt closer to her now, as if the final destruction of the Night King was a page in the cosmic story she had once believed in. Perhaps one day, if the gods allowed, their paths would cross again in the waking world. Or if not, he would ride with her in the night lands, telling tales of how he defied death to save the living. Behind him, the Dothraki riders chanted a new name for him in their language. They called him He Who Broke the Night, the Call of Dawn, the Rider of Two Worlds. As their horses thundered across the muddy roads, that chant rose to the sky, echoing over farmland and forest, a testament to the unstoppable spirit of the Horse Lords. And thus began a new chapter in the annals of Westeros, a time when men from across the sea had arrived to save a land that was not their own, forging an unlikely fellowship in the darkest hour. In the months and years that followed, the North rebuilt, fields were sown anew, and the stories of that epic battle grew in the retelling. Children gathered around hearth fires, wide-eyed, hearing how Khal Drogo, once a warlord of fabled cruelty, had laid down the Night King with a final thrust of black glass. They marveled at how the Dothraki thundered across snowy fields to shatter the legions of the dead. And in each retelling, a spark of gratitude and wonder burned, reminding the living that no darkness could prevail against the unity of those who choose to stand and fight. Of Khal Drogo himself, many whispered rumors circulated. Some said he sailed back to Essos, took the entire Khalasar across the Dothraki Sea, and reigned as an immortal king. Others said he vanished into the Red Waste, following the specter of his lost love, never to be seen again. There were tales that he continued to wander Westeros for a time, seeking any last shadows of the Night King's power, ensuring the land remained cleansed of death's lingering influence. Perhaps none but Drogo himself knew the truth. Yet the ring of House Stark upon his wrist and the scar upon his chest reminded him of the bond forged in Winterfell. In his heart, he carried the knowledge that in a world fractured by endless rivalries, life was worth fighting for, no matter the cost. So ended the long night, and so began the legend of Khal Drogo as the champion who slew Death's King. His name would forever be entwined with that of the Night King in the songs of bards and the recollections of warriors. And for as long as memory endured, men would gather in mead halls and market squares to recount the night when the entire world held its breath, waiting to see if the dawn would come, and how a fierce rider from across the sea unleashed all his savage might, all his love for freedom and life, to ensure that it did. The moon loomed over the Dothraki Sea, illuminating a vast landscape of tall grass that whispered with each gust of night wind. Khal Drogo sat astride his imposing warhorse, his eyes scanning the horizon as though searching for a sign only he could recognize. A soft glow outlined the rugged planes of his face, accentuating the braided hair that fell against his broad back. Yet the greatest mark of his story was the scar etched across his chest. A scar touched by blood magic, a lingering reminder of the day he nearly died and the night he was reborn. Though many believed Khal Drogo had perished in a foreign war, pinned low by a festering wound, fate had not released him so easily. When Daenerys Targaryen lit his funeral pyre, an ancient spell crackled through the fire's embers, forging a link between life and death that allowed his spirit to remain tethered to the mortal plane. His body healed beyond all reason, the infection vanishing as though devoured by the flames, leaving only a jagged scar where corruption had once festered. The Dothraki whispered that the great stallion had carried him back, but the truth was wrapped in shadow and the whispered prayers of a queen who walked into fire. In his first days of renewed life, Drogo wandered the grasslands alone, trying to reconcile the realms of dream and reality. Eventually, he returned to the remnants of his Khalasar, who stared in awe. Some fell to their knees, proclaiming him chosen by the gods. Others, uncertain if this truly was Drogo or an omen of dark magic, challenged him in single combat. He met them all with steel and ferocity, leaving no doubt that the man who once united the Dothraki under a single banner had indeed returned. In those battles, the bells he once wore in his braid fell away, replaced by the haunting stillness of a warrior who no longer needed ornamentation to prove his worth. Whispers carried across Essos of the great Khal's resurrection, a man no longer bound by mortal frailty. Merchants, spies, and travelers told of a towering figure with molten eyes, unstoppable in battle. Yet Drogo himself felt a mixture of displacement and fierce purpose, as though the boundary between worlds had imprinted on his soul. At night, he dreamt of fire-lit visions, a dragon's roar, a woman with silver hair, an army of the dead. He woke each morning drenched in sweat, the scar on his chest throbbing like an echo of distant thunder. Months passed. Khalasar's once split by internal strife coalesced under Drogo's name. With each victory over rival Khals, his legend grew. But Drogo sensed the real war lay far beyond the Dothraki Sea. Rumors drifted in like ghosts, speaking of a relentless menace that dwelled in the north of Westeros, a legion of corpses called Whites, commanded by pale demons known as White Walkers, all led by an otherworldly king of ice. Men claimed swords shattered against their unnatural blades. Some said entire armies had been overwhelmed, that the living would soon be swallowed by an endless winter. At first, Drogo dismissed such stories as idle superstition. The Dothraki had conquered mortal foes time and again, they would do so again if threatened. But each tale returned with more urgency, more detail, a cold creeping south, villages abandoned, alliances forged by ancient enemies to stand against a doom that transcended mortal borders. Eventually, the threat sounded too dire to be dismissed. If this Night King truly commanded an army without fear, an army that could spread undeath like a plague, then every life across Essos and Westeros stood on the brink. Drogo might have scoffed at the idea of crossing an ocean for a cause not his own, but the memory of Daenerys and the ephemeral warmth that stirred in his scar compelled him onward. He called his Khalasar to council, explaining the rumors. Many scoffed at the notion of an enemy that could not bleed. Others, awed by Drogo's mysterious rebirth, bowed in agreement without question. It was decided. They would cross the narrow sea, wage war on this supposed harbinger of endless night, and return triumphant. Raiders, warriors, bloodriders, and their families packed their tents, wrangled horses, and set forth to the coastline. A mixture of dread and exhilaration swept through the ranks, for the Dothraki had never mounted an invasion by water in such numbers. Yet Khal Drogo's iron will spurred them beyond tradition. At a port city along the eastern shores, they commandeered ships. The crossing proved fraught with storms and seasickness. Horses, unaccustomed to the rolling decks, neighed and kicked in panic. Still, Drogo remained an unyielding presence, standing at the prow with eyes fixed on the western horizon. Even the most cynical among them dared not question him. They glimpsed in their call a strange determination, as if destiny itself beckoned from the far shore. Weeks later, they landed in Westeros under storm-gray skies. Towns along the coast emptied at the sight of thousands of Dothraki pouring onto the beaches. Yet it was not conquest that drove Drogo, but the desire to test his might against the rumored undead. Overland they went, forging a path through farmland and forest, sometimes clashing with local lords who misunderstood their intent. These skirmishes ended quickly once the Dothraki circled and outmaneuvered heavily armored knights ill-suited to open warfare. In time, word spread that the Dothraki were traveling north, and envoys arrived bearing tidings of an alliance. Lords from the north spoke of Winterfell, a stronghold battered by the first waves of this undead threat. They begged for help, or at least for a meeting. Curiosity and an undercurrent of dread pulled Drogo onward. Each mile north brought colder winds. The Dothraki gazed uneasily at a land that felt perpetually cloaked in twilight. Snow began to drift across the fields, the horses snorting at the unfamiliar chill. Then, one evening, they arrived at the gates of Winterfell. It was a stark fortress of ancient stone, its walls thick with frost and soot from hastily lit fires. Soldiers patrolled the battlements, eyes wide as they beheld the endless lines of horsemen. Slowly, the gates creaked open to admit them. The courtyard as cramped with too many horses, too many men. Noblewomen in furs emerged, flanked by guards, to greet Khal Drogo. He dismounted, chest bare in defiance of the icy air, and walked forward as though he owned the place. Over the next hours, they held council in a great hall lit by smoky torches. There, Drogo met Lady Sansa Stark, a figure of quiet resolve who had been forced to gather allies from every corner of the realm. She spoke of the Night King, of how swords alone would not suffice. Valyrian steel, dragonglass, and fire were the keys. Even then, victory seemed a distant hope. Drogo listened. His eyes never left her face as she recounted horrors, white scaling walls like spiders, white walkers snapping normal blades in half with a single parry. The undead needed no rest, felt no fear. They simply marched forward, cold incarnate. The great Khal felt a flicker of anticipation burn in his scar. If the living needed a champion, he would answer. And if these nightmares were real, what better way to prove the unstoppable might of the Dothraki? In return, Drogo described how his people fought, swift cavalry strikes, swirling maneuvers that disoriented enemies, and a fierce skill honed by centuries on the open plains. The Northerners, some of whom clutched at swords in anxiety, realized they had a potent new ally. With a strategy combining the Dothraki's mobility and the North's knowledge of dragonglass and fortifications, perhaps they had a chance. The council decided that a combined force would meet the undead in open battle before they could breach Winterfell's walls. It was a gamble, but one that Drogo readily embraced. After all, only the bold deserved victory. Preparations began at once. Under the gray sky, blacksmiths toiled day and night, forging spearheads and arrowheads from dragonglass. Barrels of flammable pitch were hauled onto wagons. The Dothraki, though wary of what they deemed little sorceries, took instructions on how to incorporate fire into their tactics. They practiced firing arrows lit from pitch-soaked cloth, passing them hand to hand in the midst of a gallop. Each day that passed, the air grew colder until every breath was a puff of steam. Scouts returned with grim news. The undead horde was near, perhaps mere days away. Lady Sansa urged the combined army to fortify a position on the open fields outside Winterfell, hoping to draw the Whites into a trap lined with fiery trenches. Night fell at last, and the Dothraki rode forth under the pale moon. Thousands of horses pounded the frozen ground, forming a crescent shape. Flickers of torchlight danced on spears and the curved steel of rocks. From Winterfell's walls, archers stood ready with flaming arrows. Silence descended, heavy as the frost gathering on the parapets. None spoke, all knew what approached. Khal Drogo felt his heart thrum, an electric tension running through him. In the hush, he thought he heard Daenerys' voice in the wind, urging him onward. It began with a distant rumble like thunder rolling across a barren plain. Then came the first shapes, an ocean of ragged forms shuffling under a dim sky. An icy gust carried the stench of decay. For a moment, Drogo's blood riders exchanged anxious glances. These were not living foes who would flinch at a strong display of force. Even the most hardened Dothraki felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Yet Khal Drogo raised his arak high, the scar on his chest blazing with an inner fire. The time for fear was over, only the kill mattered now. A single shout reverberated in the frozen air, and the Dothraki charge began. Torches flared, and the thunder of hooves echoed like a heartbeat across the icy plain. The Dothraki rode in a wide arc, their voices rising in a guttural war cry that sent tremors through the dark. Flaming arrows soared from Winterfell's battlements, trailing sparks against a sky devoid of stars. When the first volley struck the ranks of the Whites, bodies ignited in bursts of sickly green-orange flame. Yet the undead pressed on, unaffected by pain or fear. They trudged forward with a single-minded purpose, skeletal hands reaching, jaws snapping in silent hunger. At the forefront of the cavalry, Khal Drogo drew his arak in a smooth motion, the polished metal reflecting the flames around him. His stallion barreled into the nearest cluster of Whites, crushing brittle bones beneath iron-shod hooves. Drogo slashed in a wide arc, severing limbs that still twitched even as they fell to the ground. The reek of decay mingled with the acrid scent of burning flesh, assaulting his senses. Yet no revulsion stayed his hand. The Dothraki thrived in the frenzy of combat, and this was a battle for the living against an unholy tide. All along the crescent, riders unleashed a deadly symphony. Dragonglass-tipped arrows found their marks, lodging in rotting chests and skulls. Such wounds might not kill a living man immediately, but for the undead, the obsidian delivered the final rest they could not deny. In the flickering light, the Dothraki seemed like wraiths themselves, darting in and out of the shambling mass, striking swiftly, then wheeling around to strike again. The key was movement, never allowing the dead to swarm them. Even so, some riders fell victim. A horse stumbled over a pile of bones, its rider catapulted into a cluster of Whites. Screams shredded the night air as cold hands dragged him down, tearing flesh from bone with relentless hunger. From Winterfell's ramparts, the archers maintained a steady rain of flaming arrows. Whenever a cluster of Whites formed too thickly, a volley would set them ablaze. The sky glowed with pockets of fire. Northmen and Knights of the Vale watched in awe at the Dothraki's fearless charges. Yet they also witnessed the dreadful reality: for every White destroyed, more pressed in, a ceaseless horde driven by the will of their icebound king. The living defenders felt a chill beyond mere winter, an existential dread that gnawed at hope. Khal Drogo led a group of his blood riders deeper into the fray, heading toward a line of White Walkers spotted near the center of the undead ranks. These tall, gaunt beings moved with eerie grace, their pale faces devoid of emotion. Frosty blades flickered in their hands, capable of turning ordinary steel into shards at the lightest touch. Drogo spurred his horse faster, brandishing his arak. When he slammed into the White Walkers' formation, the collision sparked a series of clashes that resounded like thunder. One White Walker lunged, sword of ice singing through the air. Drogo parried with the flat of his blade, feeling an immediate burst of cold that numbed his fingers. The force of the impact threatened to dislodge his weapon, but his grip held. Snarling, he twisted, driving the tip of his arak into the White Walker's flank. A high-pitched screech, like wind over frozen lakes, erupted from the creature as cracks spiderwebbed across its icy flesh. An instant later, it shattered into a swirl of crystalline shards, dissolving into the night. The Dothraki around him roared in triumph, even as two more White Walkers closed in. Meanwhile, along the battle's edge, Lady Sansa's plan to use trenches of fire took shape. Northern pikemen lit oil-soaked ditches, creating flaming barriers that corralled the Whites into kill zones. Some undead tumbled into the flames, thrashing in silent agony as their withered bodies were consumed. Others clambered over their burning brethren, pressed onward by a will that knew no surrender. The crackle of fire and the grinding of ice mingled with the screams of men and beasts alike, an orchestra of horror that tested the courage of every living soul. Amid this chaos, a sudden hush rippled through the undead ranks. Heads jerked in unison as though responding to a silent command. From a ridge beyond the trenches, the Night King appeared astride a colossal undead steed. His presence exuded a cold so profound it seemed to leach the color from the world. The whites parted to make way, collapsing into a motionless line. A hush spread across the battlefield, and the living sensed they were in the presence of something ancient and terrible. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Khal Drogo felt a sensation like ice water trickling down his spine. Across the plain, the Night King locked eyes with him. Though no words were spoken, a challenge radiated through the dark, an invitation to mortal combat. Drogo's scar pulsed with heat, as if the memory of the funeral pyre that revived him stood in direct opposition to the eternal winter embodied by this foe. With a guttural shout, he urged his horse forward. Bloodriders followed, but the Night King lifted a single hand and the newly fallen corpses on the field began to stir. Dozens of Dothraki who had perished only moments before, men who once rode proudly under Drogo's banner, rose with lifeless eyes glowing a pale blue. Winterfell archers gasped at the sight of erstwhile comrades now turned into shambling monstrosities. Some defenders recoiled, unwilling to release arrows upon men they recognized. But the dead marched without hesitation, their araks still clutched in stiffening fingers. Shock froze many into inaction, giving the undead an opening to claw and hack at the living. The great Khal witnessed his once loyal riders turned against him. An uncharacteristic pang of sorrow lanced through his chest, only to be replaced by wrath. He spurred his stallion harder, weaving between clusters of whites. With each swing of his arak, he shattered or decapitated another abomination, whether it had once been Dothraki or not. The pain in his scar intensified, and he realized with startling clarity that this was no mere battle for territory or honor. This was a war for the right to exist in a world that still breathed. A group of White Walkers advanced behind the newly risen dead, glacial swords cutting down defenders with lethal efficiency. Where their blades struck a shield or helmet, frost spread, splintering steel like brittle glass. Khal Drogo urged his blood riders to break their formation. They circled around, loosing arrows tipped with dragonglass. Some found their marks, and White Walkers exploded in showers of ice, their unearthly shrieks mingling with the whistle of the wind. Yet the Night King remained distant, observing, as if patient enough to let his minions whittle away the living before taking any personal risk. A roar shattered the brief lull. A white giant lumbered into view, towering over the battlefield. Its flesh hung in tatters, exposing raw sinew and bone, and each step left deep craters in the frozen earth. It swung a massive club fashioned from a tree trunk, scattering Dothraki riders like seeds on the wind. Horses screamed and men were hurled through the air. Khal Drogo steered his stallion around the beast's flank, rallying a dozen archers. At his signal, they unleashed a coordinated volley of flaming arrows. The giant bellowed as the arrows found purchase in its decaying hide, setting patches of flesh ablaze. Staggering, it teetered and fell, crushing a swath of whites beneath its bulk. The thunderous crash sent tremors through the ground. Cheers erupted from the living forces, but the victory was short-lived. The Night King, still mounted, raised both arms with deliberate grace. A wave of necromantic energy rippled out and fallen bodies stirred once more. Whites that had been destroyed mere moments ago twitched and rose, skeletal frames shattered yet still clinging to a foul simulacrum of life. The living reeled in horror. How could they hope to overcome an enemy that could replenish itself with every casualty? Drogo swung his blade in frustration, slicing through a reanimated Dothraki he recognized from earlier battles. His mind churned with strategy. They needed to reach the Night King. Cut off the head and the serpent would die. But a swarm of undead, reinforced by the newly resurrected, ringed the pale king like a fortress of rotted flesh. The Dothraki had never shied from direct confrontation, yet the cost would be staggering. If they did nothing, the defenders would be overwhelmed. From the corner of his vision, Drogo spotted Lady Sansa and a group of northern knights leading a reserve force. They hacked through the whites, forming a wedge in the sea of darkness. With frantic urgency, they signaled for Drogo to converge. Understanding flickered between them. The only hope was a coordinated strike. Drogo nodded, then bellowed a command in the Dothraki tongue. His warriors shifted formation, funneling whites into pockets where dragonglass spears and flaming arrows could do the most damage. Despite the swirling chaos, a plan took shape. They would feign a retreat in one sector, luring a large cluster of whites away, thinning the defensive circle around the Night King. Simultaneously, a cavalry charge led by Drogo and a detachment of knights would break through from the opposite flank. It was a desperate gambit, but the alternative was waiting to be slowly ground into oblivion. Cresting a small rise, Drogo and his riders galloped across churned snow, hearts pounding like war drums. The battered remains of the undead host shambled to meet them. At the same moment, the retreating contingent of Northmen to the left collapsed inward, drawing half the whites after them. The Night King turned his cold gaze toward this maneuver, curious but not alarmed. Perhaps he did not believe mortal cunning could pose a genuine threat to his eternal campaign. That was his error. A crucial gap opened in the ring of dead. Khal Drogo and the knights pounced on the opportunity, plunging straight toward the Night King's position. He reacted at last, dismounting with preternatural grace. The undead steed snorted a cloud of icy vapor and dissolved into bone fragments with a gesture from its master. Now, face to face on the battlefield, Drogo and the Night King closed the distance. At once, whites swarmed to protect their leader, but the living poured in behind Drogo, forging a spearhead that pierced the enemy lines. The final yards were a blur of severed limbs, sparks from steel colliding with ice, and the coppery tang of blood. Drogo's world narrowed to a single point. The Night King, his face a mask of ancient wrath. Raising his arak high, Drogo roared a challenge that reverberated across the battlefield. The Night King lifted an ice-forged sword, its surface etched with runic symbols that refracted the moonlight. No words were exchanged. The moment for talk was long past. Their blades clashed with an impact that radiated frost and heat in equal measure. Drogo felt the shock travel up his arms, numbing his fingers. The Night King's strength was immense, bolstered by centuries of dark magic. Yet Khal Drogo refused to yield. He twisted, hooking his arak around the Night King's blade, attempting to disarm him. A frigid pulse shot through the metal, chilling Drogo's bones, but he persevered. With a savage yank, he nearly unbalanced the pale monarch. For a heartbeat, the Night King's eyes blazed with blue fire. He thrust his free hand forward, unleashing a blast of wintry wind that slammed Drogo backward. The great Khal landed hard, snow spraying around him. His warhorse reared, kicking the air in panic. Before Drogo could recover, the Night King advanced, blade descending in a swift arc. At the last instant, Drogo rolled aside, feeling the cold bite of the sword graze his shoulder. Pain flared, yet it was the numbness that worried him most. A creeping frost threatened to lock his muscles. Gritting his teeth, he forced himself to stand. Now the Night King loomed over him, head tilted as if examining a curious specimen that had managed to survive longer than expected. From every corner, men and whites died in droves. The ring of combat began to tighten around them. The living knew that if Drogo fell, morale would shatter. The Dothraki, especially, looked on with desperation. Many tried to intervene, only to be stopped by White Walkers that guarded the perimeter. The swirling melee became an arena for the final showdown. In that bleak moment, Drogo recalled the heat of Daenerys' pyre, the flicker of flames dancing across scales of newly hatched dragons. He remembered the taste of magic that had pulled him back from death. Summoning that memory, he raised his arak again. The scar on his chest felt molten, a brand that ignited his rage. He charged, ignoring the shriek of frost in his veins. The Night King met him blow for blow. Ice and steel collided, sparks flying in eerie blue arcs. Each strike threatened to crack Drogo's weapon or freeze him in place, but he struck relentlessly, seeking any weakness. Time lost meaning in that deadly dance. Drogo managed to deliver a slash across the Night King's arm, chipping away at the ancient creature's icy armor. Black fissures marred the pale skin, a sign that even this being was not invulnerable. Yet the Night King retaliated with a vicious backhand, sending Drogo reeling. The cold struck like a venom, and for an instant, Drogo's vision blurred. His knees buckled in the snow, breath ragged. But surrender was not in the great Khal's nature. With a final surge of will, he lunged upward, driving his arak into the Night King's torso. A burst of frigid air exploded outward, throwing Drogo back. For an agonizing heartbeat, everything froze. Time, breath, even the swirling snow. Then the Night King let out a piercing wail. Cracks spread across his form like a shattered mirror. In a blinding flash, he disintegrated into shards of ice that rained down on the battlefield. A wave of shock passed through the undead army. Whites collapsed by the hundreds, their unnatural light extinguished. White Walkers fragmented into icy debris drifting away on the wind. The dread that had paralyzed the living lifted as if a suffocating blanket had been whisked away. Khal Drogo lay in the snow, body trembling from cold and exhaustion. Gradually, he realized the battle had ended. All around, Dothraki, Northmen, and Knights stood among heaps of motionless corpses. Steam rose from the broken remains of Whites, and the faint crackle of dying flames lingered in the air. A stunned silence settled as the defenders struggled to process what they had just witnessed. The Night King was no more, his legion undone in a single moment. A ragged cheer broke out, halting at first, then growing into a triumphant roar that spanned the battlefield. Swords clashed against shields, and the Dothraki raised their voices in an ululating cry of victory. Some men wept openly, overcome by relief. Others simply sank to their knees, murmuring thanks to whatever gods they revered. Winterfell's ramparts echoed with cheers as archers lowered their bows, blinking in disbelief. Blood Riders rushed to Khal Drogo's side, helping him stand. His legs felt like ice, and his shoulder wound stung with unnatural cold, but he was alive. Craning his neck, he surveyed the carnage. The ground was a patchwork of scorched earth, frozen corpses, and battered warriors. He met the gaze of Lady Sansa Stark, who stood near the trenches, hair disheveled, tears gleaming in her eyes. She inclined her head in acknowledgement, silent gratitude radiating from her. Though neither spoke the other's tongue fluently, the meaning was clear: the North was saved. In the days that followed, the living turned their attention to the wounded and the dead. Pyres burned high, sending columns of smoke into the gray sky. Survivors scoured the battlefield to ensure no straggling Whites remained. The stench of death permeated every breath, but it was the death of an enemy that would never rise again. Among the scattered ashes, fragments of the Night King's frosty blade occasionally turned up, melting upon contact as if the magic that sustained it had vanished with its master. Within Winterfell, a subdued celebration took shape. Food was scarce, and sorrow weighed heavy for the countless lives lost, yet the living gathered in the castle's great hall to honor their unlikely savior. The Dothraki, unaccustomed to dining within stone walls, joined with uncharacteristic solemnity. Khal Drogo, bandaged and still feverish from the chill, sat in a place of honor beside Lady Sansa. The talk was muted, expressions of gratitude, recollections of the darkest moments, and the strange euphoria of survival. A hush fell when Sansa raised her cup to Drogo, speaking halting words that were translated by a Northman. She proclaimed him champion of the living, the warrior who shattered the long night. Applause rippled through the hall, cautious but sincere. Drogo accepted the praise with minimal reaction. He was a man of action, not ceremony. Yet inside, he felt a quiet sense of vindication. In that final confrontation, he had proven that destiny could be molded by will. He recalled the day he first crossed the narrow sea, uncertain if the rumors of ice demons were more than fables. He thought of the scar that pulsed upon his chest, the symbol of a second life granted by fire, used now to banish an eternal winter. As he raised his cup in a silent toast, the Dothraki around him thumped their chests, celebrating not just a victory but the unstoppable spirit of their Khal. Once the feasting ended, practical matters emerged. Winterfell's larders were nearly depleted, and so many men were injured that the fortress struggled to function. Word spread that other parts of Westeros remained in disarray, though the worst of the undead threat had been neutralized. Scouts returned with news of pockets of Whites collapsing upon the Night King's destruction as if marionettes abandoned by their puppeteer. The realm now faced the daunting task of rebuilding. Khal Drogo pondered his next steps. The cold, cramped corridors of Winterfell did not suit the Dothraki. Some warriors itched to return to the open expanses of Essos. Yet others wondered if Westeros was now ripe for conquest, unguarded in the aftermath of the undead invasion. Drogo dismissed such talk with a wave of his hand. He had not crossed the sea to pillage a ravaged land. The deep ache in his shoulder reminded him that the war had cost too many lives already. If the gods demanded further blood, let it be spilled for a cause worthier than opportunistic looting. He found Lady Sansa one evening, standing by a broken section of the castle wall, gazing at a courtyard where survivors labored to clear rubble. The sky was tinged with the last purples of sunset. Through a translator, she spoke of gratitude and sorrow, uncertain how to repay a debt so vast. Drogo's response was simple. He needed no tribute, no gold. The living had fought together, that was enough. Pressing a rough-hewn ring into her palm, a token of Dothraki solidarity, he turned to leave, but her voice halted him. She promised that Winterfell would always welcome him should he or his people ever need refuge. An uneasy friendship formed in that silent exchange, bridging two worlds that had once seemed irreconcilable. At dawn, a detachment of Northmen joined the Dothraki intending to the remaining funeral rites. Horses stood quietly, steam rising from their muzzles in the chill air. Wooden pyres were stacked high with the bodies of wights, their twisted forms hissing when touched by flame. To the side lay the Dothraki fallen, wrapped in cloth. In their tradition, fallen warriors were cremated beneath the sky so their souls could gallop across the night lands. Drogo personally lit the pyre that held the bodies of his bloodriders, men who had stood by him since the grasslands of Essos. The flames roared, devouring old loyalties and forging something new in their stead, a bond between people who had once been worlds apart. That night, the Khalasar convened in the open field beyond Winterfell, eager to depart. As they gathered horses and supplies, a hush fell. Khal Drogo emerged from the fortress, his injuries still healing but his posture unbowed. With a sweep of his gaze, he acknowledged the Northmen who had ventured out to see him off. Lady Sansa stood among them, hands clasped before her. No grand speeches were needed. The alliance had been sealed in blood and steel. Mounting his stallion, Drogo led his warriors away from the castle that had once been a bastion against endless night. They traveled south, passing through lands battered by cold. Hills were scarred by old battles, villages abandoned or burned. At first, the Dothraki encountered fearful peasants who hid at the approach of mounted hordes. But word spread quickly that these riders were not pillaging, rather, they offered what little aid they could. Some villages welcomed them with bread and salt, the customary sign of hospitality. An uneasy peace accompanied their passage, as though the land itself was too exhausted by horror to muster further resistance. Eventually, they reached the coast where ships awaited to return them to Essos. The crossing was calmer this time, though the men and horses still detested the swaying decks. Drogo stood at the prow of the largest vessel, gaze fixed eastward. Clouds drifted overhead, tinted pink by the rising sun. He wondered if Daenerys still lived somewhere in this world, commanding dragons, forging realms. Perhaps their paths would cross again. The wind carried the faintest scent of salt and freedom, reminding him of the wide expanses of the Dothraki Sea. When they landed on Essos' shores, it was as though a collective sigh escaped the Khalasar. Hoofs trod familiar ground, stirring dust under a sun that felt much warmer than the perpetual chill of Westeros. Messengers galloped ahead to spread the word that the great Khal had returned victorious from a distant war. Over the following weeks, droves of riders from other Khalasars arrived to pay homage or issue challenges. Drogo met each threat with the same cold efficiency he had shown in Westeros, leaving no doubt that the man who slew the Night King would not be cowed by mortal opponents. Yet a subtle change had taken hold. Where once he might have reveled in the spoils of conquest, Drogo now found a deeper purpose stirring within him. He recalled the nights he spent in Winterfell's halls, the desperation in Sansa Stark's voice as she spoke of a threat that united all mankind. That unity had proven fleeting, but its memory lingered. In time, he led his riders not to mindless raids, but to confront slavers and bandits in the borderlands, offering freedom to those held in chains. Some among the Dothraki muttered that this was weakness, a betrayal of their heritage. But most understood that a Khal who had faced death incarnate might now view the world differently, as a place worth preserving rather than merely plundering. Nevertheless, the Dothraki Sea remained Drogo's domain. He reveled in the open grass, the sense of endless horizon. On starry nights, he gazed at the heavens and imagined the northern lights dancing above Winterfell's ramparts, an echo of the final battle. The scar over his heart no longer burned, yet sometimes it pulsed with a phantom warmth, as if reminding him of the cosmic dance between fire and ice that he had briefly joined. Season after season passed. Tales of Khal Drogo's confrontation with the undead settled into legend. Travelers crossing into Westeros repeated the story of how a horde of horsemen saved the north from a silent apocalypse. Minstrels embellished the details, turning Drogo into an almost mythical figure. Some claimed he commanded flames with a word. Others said the Night King had crumbled in terror at the sight of him. The truth, as always, was more complicated. Drogo cared little for the stories. He let them swirl beyond the grasslands. What mattered was that he had kept his promise to stand against the darkness. One evening, as the sun dipped low and turned the grass to molten gold, Drogo sat outside his tent, listening to the rumble of distant thunder. A young warrior approached, eyes shining with devotion. He spoke of forging new conquests, crossing the sea again to claim more glory. Drogo shook his head. Glory, he replied in a heavy accent, could be found in defending what mattered, not just in seizing what did not. The warrior listened, uncertain, but bowed in respect. Later that night, Drogo rose and walked alone into the open plain. Overhead, a scattering of stars shimmered like jewels. In the quiet, he heard the murmur of the wind across the grass, the same voice that once lured him to Westeros. Now it whispered of contentment and challenge intertwined, of battles won and others yet unseen. He touched the scar on his chest and remembered how close death had come to claiming him. Perhaps it would claim him still in another battle or at the end of a long life. But for now, he led a people who had fought at his side against an enemy that defied imagination. For now, he was the Khal who had turned the tide against the night. With a deep breath, he threw back his head and let out a fierce cry that carried across the stars. And somewhere, in the far corners of that infinite sky, he felt the night answer with a promise that he would not walk alone. Whether in life or the realm beyond, he had carved a place for himself in the grand tapestry of ice and fire, and no mortal or immortal could ever take that away. Seasons later, the story of how Khal Drogo defeated the Night King still drifted across distant taverns and bustling caravan routes. Some recounted it as a grand epic of ice meeting fire, others as a testament to the boundless determination of men when faced with extinction. Most versions agreed on one point: Khal Drogo, the mighty warlord of the Dothraki Sea, had stood unflinchingly against an enemy that chilled the marrow of kings and peasants alike. In so doing, he had turned aside the shadow of an endless night. Over time, curiosities grew about the man himself. Merchants who ventured into the Dothraki Sea spoke of encountering a Khal who bore himself with silent authority, his chest marked by a scar rumored to be a portal through which death once reached. They claimed he often gazed into the distance as though listening for echoes from another land. Yet his rule was neither soft nor cruel. He led the Dothraki with a clear resolve, clashing with those who tested him, sparing those who submitted. Within his camp were freed slaves and travelers from the free cities, a testament to how his worldview had shifted after crossing the sea. Other Khals found him an enigma. They challenged his decisions to intervene against slavers or to negotiate trade routes rather than pillage them outright. Drogo simply answered that he had seen a threat greater than any mortal ambition, a threat that taught him the preciousness of life. If some labeled it weakness, they soon discovered the steel in his resolve when they tested him in combat. One by one, they recognized that the man who toppled the Night King was not to be trifled with. On rare nights, Drogo would sit by a small fire, listening to the crackle of burning wood. He recalled how flaming arrows once lit the sky over Winterfell, each spark a fragile hope against the tide of death. The memory stirred a warmth in his scar that reminded him of his bond to Daenerys, though he no longer knew where she walked. Perhaps she had conquered other realms or perished in some distant conflict. Such was the nature of the world. It offered no guarantees, only fleeting moments of brilliance. Yet a subtle contentment filled him. The Dothraki Sea sprawled like a living tapestry, the grass swaying in waves of green and gold. When the sun rose each day, its light glistened on his people's banners and his horses roamed freely under endless skies. Here he was at home, unconfined by stone walls or heavy crowns. Sometimes, in the hush of dawn, he remembered Sansa Stark's earnest face, her unwavering determination to protect her homeland. He could still feel the final shudder as the Night King split into shards, undone by the sheer force of mortal defiance. That memory affirmed that even in a world of warring factions, alliances could form out of necessity and endure as symbols of hope. Over time, the Khalasar grew larger than it had ever been, absorbing wandering tribes and forging fragile peace with neighboring regions. From Qohor to Volantis, men spoke of Khal Drogo with mixtures of awe and curiosity. He was a living legend, a warlord who had ventured across the sea to save a kingdom not his own. In a way, the realm he returned to had transformed, just as he had. No longer a place of mindless raids, the Dothraki Sea became a power in its own right, a domain guided by a leader who knew that true strength could be tempered by purpose. Still, the call of the horizon never left him. Some evenings, Drogo mounted his stallion and rode alone until the campfires receded into pinpoints of light behind him. He'd halt atop a gentle rise, staring into the distance where the sky met the grass. The wind teased his braids, and in its whisper he imagined the voices of all those he had fought for and lost, the men who fell at Winterfell, the loved ones he had failed to protect long ago. These ghosts did not burden him but reminded him of the fragile line between life and oblivion and how once he had crossed it only to be pulled back by fire. One night he dismounted to rest beside a clear brook under a canopy of stars. Leaning against his saddle, he let the silence embrace him. Gradually, he became aware of a faint warmth radiating from his scar, like an echo of the funeral pyre that once blazed around him. He closed his eyes and listened to the gentle ripple of water, feeling at peace with the collision of his past and present. Death had brushed him and the dead had nearly devoured the world, but here he stood, a testament to life's endurance. At last, he rose, slipping back into the saddle. Far behind him, the tents of his Khalasar glowed like a scattered constellation on earth. Home. With a light nudge of his heels, he guided the stallion into a steady canter. The grass parted before them in silken waves, and the night air carried a crisp promise of future trials, of old stories blooming into new legends. He had shattered the Night King and preserved a kingdom across the sea. Now, in the warm arms of the Dothraki plain, Khal Drogo rode on, free and indomitable, ever ready to face whatever horizon beckoned next.